Good morning, Liberty. It is Wednesday morning, April 17th, 2019. My name is Michael Boldin, broadcasting to you live from my home office and studio here in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. It is 9:30 a.m. Pacific time, so good morning to you if you're watching live, or maybe good afternoon on the East Coast, or good evening if you're watching later on in the archives. It doesn't matter when you're joining me. I really think it's amazing that you'd like to spend a little time with me today. Thank you so much for being here. Now, on today's show, I want to go a little further into, it's almost like a follow-up to my episode on Monday, which was titled Taxation is Theft, primarily a general principle that they're stealing from us. Now we get a report from Mike Meharry that actually he did a blog for Peter Schiff at schiffgold.com that we reposted here at the 10th Amendment Center, talking about the latest financial health of the federal government. And the numbers are just atrocious. You could never see a business continue doing something like this with the amount of negative net worth that they have. I also want to cover the top 11 places that they're spending this money that they don't even have in the first place. I found an interesting article over at FEE.org, Foundation for Electronic Education. And this all kind of comes back to something that I thought of recently in regards to spending. We posted a number of memes on our social channels from regarding tax day or tax theft day in the last few days, over the weekend and through Monday and Tuesday. And two of them in particular, from Thomas Paine and from James Madison, made the connection between taxes and the warfare state. Now, I'm not necessarily going to talk about that particularly in any detail today, but for me, it's a great motivator in recognizing that the amount that they tax and spend really has a great deal in part to do with the empire. James Madison specifically said that the three greatest threats to liberty were armies, debts, and taxes. And let me tell you, we've got a trifecta today. Thomas Paine, on the other hand, felt that, at least in the history of the British Empire, which was the greatest empire at that time, now to be supplanted by the largest government in the history of the world, the U.S., I guess we can call it federal, in quotes, federal government, is much larger than the British Empire ever was. And he thought, at least at the British Empire, that taxes weren't raised to carry on the wars. He said that wars were raised to keep the taxes. And I think we realize that once they have a spending program in place, it doesn't necessarily have to just be war, but once they have a spending program in place, it'll just continue forever and ever. They have to keep doing it. Otherwise, they have to actually cut employees. And no one likes cutting employees if they're a politician. They don't really like doing that. So I'm going to get all that in a moment here and say hello to some friends over in the live chat. We are live streaming through our Restream account through Facebook, YouTube, Periscope, which also goes to our Twitter account, and now DLive, the blockchain live streaming platform. I figured if PewDiePie from YouTube is over there, we should at least get there too, because a lot of people are joining that platform. So a quick hello over on YouTube. Woodsider, good to see you. Jeremy Anderson, Justin Bayola, Robert Sanderson, Larry Clark, and a number of other people over on Facebook. Logan, Jerry, Michael, Frederick, Jay, Clay, Rob Wood, good to see you, buddy. In Kansas, Rob, haven't seen you in a while. Good to see you here. Thank you for joining me on this live stream. So let's get into it. Oh, one thing that I thought of in regards to war was years ago, I think it was like 2007 or so, at least according to this article I found, I actually went to see a speech in Whittier, which is a suburb here in Southern California in the LA area. I saw a speech from a guy named Chalmers Johnson. And Chalmers Johnson was this former CIA asset. He was the CIA expert for maybe Southeast Asia in the late 60s, early 70s. Pretty well versed in imperial policy, warfare, and things like that. And he gave this speech regarding his book. He wrote a trilogy of books that Ron Paul cited for his foreign policy expertise. And Chalmers said in that speech something that really, it really stuck out to me. He said, "Things that can't go on forever don't." And he was giving a warning. This was primarily a liberal audience that was there, because the anti-war movement under George Bush was primarily a leftist anti-war movement. Unfortunately, there were some libertarians and others there, but it was primarily from the left. Once Obama came in, of course, they were gone, and now we start seeing some rumblings of it again. It's unfortunate that so many people don't really have principles, or they shift their principles knowingly or unknowingly based on who's in charge in Washington, D.C. And as Neil Archer says in the live chat, he says, when re-election is the number one concern of our government representatives, the idea that you can never make everyone happy comes into play with every pork-filled bill that passes through Congress. Yeah, absolutely. We're going to get into that a little bit more. So Chalmers Johnson was talking about the fact, and I'm not sure the numbers that he used, but he basically was saying, look, to continue this military empire, because that's what he called it, that's what I call it. The U.S. has a military presence in, 150, 170 nations around the world? I'm not sure what the exact number is, but it's huge. He said to continue doing this, they're having to borrow billions and billions of dollars from the Chinese. And sooner or later, this is going to come apart. And his warning was, you may think of it falling to pieces, creating like a glorious new American revolution. But he said anyone who studies history recognizes that an economic collapse more likely results in a new Mao, a dictator, an iron fist that comes out of the rubble. And he says this is a very dangerous situation. And I found this article that was talking about his speech from the San Bernardino Sun, it looks like, just before he gave the speech. And the quote that he said was, "All empires fall, but I don't think we'll go out with a nuclear bang. It will be a financial whimper." That was back in 2007. Unfortunately, he passed, but I think there's a lot of wisdom there. So let's get into some of the things that I wanted to cover today. First of all, this article from Mike Meharry. The title is, "The federal government has a negative net worth of $21.5 trillion. And it actually is far worse than this, but these are the official numbers. One of my closest friends, longest friends here, used to date a statistician. She now works for the United Nations. And I remember we were hanging out on Venice Beach or something at some point, and she said, as a statistician, every time I see something like this, she sees the clear picture of how they're actually skewing the numbers, because you can take numbers and tell a picture that you want to, or paint a picture that you want to paint. And I think, according to the financial report of the United States government, which comes out annually from the U.S. Treasury Department, they were late this year. That's how bad they are. They can't even get their annual report done on time. I think the best picture they could paint was that the federal government has a negative net worth of $21.5 trillion. Negative $21.5 trillion. And he says, Mike goes on in this report, total net worth, the country's assets minus its liabilities, is just one of many disturbing data points you'll find in the report. The U.S. government owns $3.8 trillion in assets. Of course, if you're a business, you want a lot of assets to be able to offset any negative net worth. And Scott Lashua points out that it doesn't include unfunded liabilities. And yeah, we're getting to that here briefly. $3.8 trillion in assets that the U.S. government has. But of course, it's primarily line items. The largest asset, and this is what really kind of shook me a little bit, the largest asset is $1.4 trillion in net loans receivable. These, Mike writes, are primarily government-backed student loans totaling $1.08 trillion. So the number one asset of the U.S. federal government is a line item on student loans receivable. Government-backed student loans. Over at Sovereign Man, Simon Black put it this way. In other words, the government's number one asset is the debt owed to it by young people across America. That's pretty sad. They aren't going to pay this back. So many of them default. I don't know if I'm going to encourage that, but maybe. The whole thing has been a ripoff and a scam since day one. And to actually have the accounting show this, certainly the numbers are the numbers. And yeah, if you're doing accounting, you're going to say, yeah, we're owed X amount of dollars. I'm not sure who this we is, but as an organization, the federal government, the Treasury Department is going to say, yeah, this is owed to us. So, of course, our negative net worth isn't as bad because we're owed another $1 trillion. And we're definitely going to collect that. It's absolutely sad and absurd. Mike goes on, he says, the government's liabilities totaled more than $25 trillion. $25 trillion just in base liabilities. We haven't even gotten to the unfunded part. This includes the national debt, accrued interest, and federal employee and federal veteran benefits. It doesn't include everything. So it's actually far worse than liabilities of $25 trillion. And again, things that can't go on forever don't. They cannot continue printing their way out of this. Eventually, it will come to pieces. Mike goes on, he says, the overall trend isn't encouraging either. In fact, the government's net worth is on a steadily downward trajectory. Republicans want to blame Obama for the country's abysmal fiscal situation, but the Trump administration and the Republican-controlled Congress did exactly zero to reverse the trend. Are you tired of all the winning yet? Because in 2014, it was about negative 18 trillion. 2015, also negative 18. 2016, negative 19. 2017, negative 20. It just keeps getting worse. It just keeps getting worse and worse and worse. And there is no defense for the continued massive spending on massively unconstitutional federal agencies, programs, regulatory acts, all of it. There is no excuse. I know the Obama people kept making excuses for his warlike behavior and failure or a lie about closing Guantanamo, which he promised. Whether you support or oppose these things, he was basically brought in, and a number of people wanted him to do these things, and he failed. A lot of people wanted the Trump administration to right the ship, and over the first 2+ years, at least on the economy, I know everyone wants to tell you that it's the greatest economy in history, but there is no such thing as the greatest economy in history if you are building upon the debt towards collapse that Obama gave us and that Bush gave us and that Clinton gave us and the rest of these unconstitutional monsters. Now, Mike goes on. He says, when you include the government's estimate of Social Security's unfunded liabilities, the country's net worth drops to negative $75 trillion. $75 trillion. Simon Black says this is roughly the size of the entire global economy. The negative net worth of the United States is $75 trillion. It seems a bit of an understatement when the Treasury Department calls U.S. fiscal policy, quote, not sustainable. Absolutely not sustainable. And again, that brings me back to Chalmers Johnson's point. Things that can't go on forever don't. And I also included the link here. And of course, you can find all the links in the show notes, primarily if you're watching YouTube, if you're watching live. The show notes are in YouTube. But if you are in the archives or you just want to jump back and forth, 10thamendmentcenter.com/Good Morning Liberty, all spelled out. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/Good Morning Liberty. That's where you can find all the archives to our show, the links that I reference in most of these shows, most of the links that I reference in these shows, and of course, where you can subscribe, find all the archives, etc. So this sovereignman.com article points out they're not actually sugarcoating it and saying it's negative $21.5 trillion. The title of the article, U.S. government's net worth is now negative $75 trillion. And from the government's report, you can actually download it. I didn't include the link to the PDF. If you want to read through these horrible numbers, go for it. But here's some of the highlights. In fiscal year 2018, the government's total net loss was $1.16 trillion. Uncle Sam collected way too much in tax revenue, $3.4 trillion in fiscal year 2018. But they spent over $4.5 trillion. So while I'm in favor of tax cuts, I would like to see everyone's income tax cut to zero. I know a lot of people complain that it's just the upper percentage paying the majority of the income tax, but there's like 77 million people who are paying zero in income taxes. I would like to see it build upon that. That's a very good start in my book. But with all this spending, you're still going to have a serious problem. And if they're spending $4.5 trillion, this cannot continue forever. Sovereign Man, or Simon Black over here at Sovereign Man, points out that nearly half went to Social Security and Medicare. And they also spent a record $523 billion, $500 billion just on interest payments on the national debt. And if you want to think about a lot of the talk about the Federal Reserve, the idea of raising interest rates means this interest rate on the national debt, the amount that they have to pay, goes through the roof. So there are many reasons. It's not just to flood the economy with newly printed money and screw the value of the dollar. What has it gone down? Like 90, 95% since 1913? Horrible year. Horrible foundational year for the empire, or for liberty, really. Great for the empire. But not only are they destroying the value of the dollar, they're actually continuing to prop up this unconstitutional spending from the federal government, this massive spending. Now, mind you, and I've said this many times now, Thomas Jefferson, when he took office in 1800, or I guess it would have been the election of 1800, when Thomas Jefferson actually took office in 1801, if my numbers are right, I apologize if I got that wrong. But when Jefferson took office, he was concerned about the national debt at a time when there were only about 130 non-military employees for the entire country. Now, of course, the federal government didn't do much at the time, but that's the point. They're not supposed to do much. The size of the country geographically was much smaller, but still, even with a much larger country, they still only had 130 non-military employees, and he was complaining. He's like, man, we got to do some cuts. And there's no one today that would ever talk about cutting at a time when government was that small in relationship to anything. So half of it went to Social Security and Medicare. And here's this article over at fee.org, which is one of my daily reads. The federal government will spend $35,148 per household in 2019. And here's where it goes. So again, just a reminder that this year, the article, this is from Brian Riedel, will spend a staggering $35,000 some odd dollars per household and collect about $27,000 in taxes. So they're just going further and further into debt. Now, if you and I were to do that, sooner or later, American Express or MasterCard or Visa or Discover would be calling, or the banks would be calling saying, hey, you know what? If you don't do this, we're foreclosing on whatever you own, or we're shutting down your accounts. We're taking your bank accounts. The federal government just keeps they get rewarded with more funding every time they run out of cash. They just keep spending more money. And then they pass bigger and bigger spending bills. But then they continue to spend more than the spending bills, or more than the revenue. I guess I hate calling it revenue because they're stealing. And it's even compounded when they're stealing to do stuff that they've never been authorized to do in the first place. So it is a double, massive ripoff. So the article, Brian goes on, he says the resulting budget deficit of $8,471 per household will bring the total national debt to $177,000 per household. This spending has soared by about $7,000 per household since 2007 and is projected to rise another $7,000 over the next decade. And this is all adjusted for inflation. And of course, unless spending is reined in, this is what I hear on Peter Schiff's podcast. I listen to him through YouTube, but I know you can subscribe over on iTunes. And I think on this, he's been really, really solid. He's like, look, if you cut spending, if you cut taxes and you don't cut spending, you are creating an environment where the even bigger government people, when they get in, when the Green New Deal types get power, if they ever do, they're going to go nuts with tax raises. Of course, the tax cuts are only temporary. They have to be renewed by Congress in the future. So they're going to get bad if spending doesn't get cut. Things are going to get really crazy, I think, if they're not already there. So here's the breakdown, the top 11 things. The top 11 things. The breakdown of how they're spending this $35,000 per household. First, of course, is Social Security and Medicare. It's about $13,000 per household. And Brian writes, as 74 million retiring baby boomers are added to this fragile system, paying all promised benefits would eventually require raising the payroll tax to 33% or imposing a 34% value-added tax, basically a national sales tax. And I think this goes to my point that I was making on Monday. I don't want to see a fair tax, a flat tax of nothing. I don't want any income tax at all. I don't want a national sales tax. I don't want to change the way that they fund their system. That's not addressing the problem. The problem is that they are involved in everything, and they shouldn't be involved in much at all. There's like 35 powers throughout the Constitution, about 18 with necessary and proper in Article 1 Section 8 of the Constitution. There are not many things. Most everything should be kept back at home, closer to the individual in the states. That doesn't even mean states should be doing all these things, but it's up to the people of each state. If you have a super socialist state in Vermont and California, Oklahoma, and I don't know, what's another good one? What's another one? Florida, Tennessee, they can do things differently. Not that I'm saying that politicians are better or worse anywhere. In general, they're all evil people. And there are very few good people that are attracted to positions of power like this. There are some, of course, but most of them are bad. But yes, the federal government is involved in way too much stuff. And just changing how they get their funding is just going to give them an excuse. So if you impose a national sales tax, sooner or later, someone is going to say, well, we can't give up on our seniors. We've given them a promise. We've promised them to have this. Don't touch my Medicare. Don't touch my Social Security. That's what the voters will say. And most voters tend to be getting to that age, getting the Social Security. They vote far more than the people that are younger. And of course, it's a self-perpetuating system. And according to FEE, they need about a 34% national sales tax in order to pay for this, VAT. 2, anti-poverty programs are $6,400, $6,500. Half of this subsidizes state Medicaid programs. The third, they call defense. I think there's very little defense spending done by the U.S. federal government. Most of it is offense spending. Most of it is pork barrel spending. A lot of it is surveillance spending. This doesn't even include the black budgets that Chalmers Johnson talked about in that speech back in 2007. He said there is just a massive, basically, military black budget that doesn't even go on the books. Or maybe there is a line item somewhere. But defense spending. This covers everything from military paychecks to operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the military being based all around the world where it shouldn't be. They should bring them all home. Interest on the national debt is $3,000 per household. The federal government, Brian writes, is $22 trillion in debt. It owes $17 trillion to public bond owners and the rest to other federal agencies, mostly to repay the Social Security Trust Fund, which lawmakers raided annually before the program fell into permanent deficit in 2009. Veterans benefits is about $1,500. Federal employee retirement benefits is $1,100. That would be so much less if there weren't so many damn federal employees. Most of them should have other jobs. If you're a federal employee, odds are you are working for an unconstitutional program. Like, I understand everyone needs to feed their family, but the federal government is a nasty, nasty organization, and I would encourage anything you can to go work elsewhere. Education, about $900. Justice Administration, they do very little. Justice is $557. Health research and regulation. I don't know where the federal government has any constitutional authority to be involved in the health industry, but they are. $533 per household. Highways and mass transit. Certainly, post roads were interstate highways of today. Not every road. Everyone thinks that the funding of post offices and post roads actually meant that they can fund and control every road over which mail travels. But a post road was a common name for roads with posts, maybe at mile markers, multiple mile markers, but it wasn't every single road that existed. So the federal government does not have the constitutional authority to be engaged in so much funding on highways, and especially not in mass transit. International affairs is $422, and Brian goes on. He says the programs listed above cover $33,618 per household. The remaining $1,530 is allocated to all other federal programs, national resources, all kinds of other stuff. Eric Nance says over on Facebook, compartmentalization is a safety net protecting from catastrophic failure. The feds were supposed to have minimal powers in order to represent the Union of States on the world stage. Internal issues are at most state issues. Jeremy Anderson over on YouTube says, even here in Idaho Falls, the few leftists are constantly screaming, and so the squeaky wheel gets all the grease. Unfortunately, and the leftists scream heavily about the social safety net programs, but on the right, they scream about military funding. They talk about how Obama decimated the military, but this is just bull. Obama cut the rate of increase in military spending. There wasn't an actual real cut. And we hear about that you have to have funding for surveillance, mass surveillance. The Trump administration extended the Patriot Act spine, the FISA spine. We've had so much more spending on so-called defense. And of course, they're not cutting Social Security or any of these things, and they're not even going to get rid of Obamacare. They want to repeal and replace it maybe after the next election, even though it was going to be gone on day one. So left and right, they continue to clamor for more spending on drug war, whatever it may be. It's just a different flavor of spending for each side. Now, good constitutionalists, like probably Jeremy here on YouTube, probably don't want to spend on any of this garbage. I don't. I don't at all. Neil Archer says you can raise taxes to pay for what is going on now, but no one understands that. And every government official just wants to spend it on keep my job in Congress stuff. Jeremy says they just had a voter initiative expansion to Medicare that passed. Yeah, it's interesting in how a lot of the Republican or the red-leaning states or the red states, while Obama was in office, were opposed to this expansion of Medicare, and now they're all on board. I saw an article recently talking about how a lot of Republicans have really changed their tune on national health care. And of course, Medicare Part D was the largest expansion of federal involvement in health care since the 1960s, and that was passed by a Republican-controlled Congress and signed by Republican George W. Bush. So Obamacare was just worse and building upon that. So any repeal and replace that doesn't get rid of the replace part is not a good program going forward. So the last thing I want to cover here just briefly is this article over at Schiff Gold, Debt and Taxes. I'm assuming Mike Meharry wrote this because he does a lot of the coverage here. But he's talking about the payment on the interest rate on the debt, which is really going to be a serious problem. Again, right now it's about, per household, it's $3,000. So it's ranked number 1, 2, 3, 4, just after military offense and defense combined, of $5,300 per household. The interest on the national debt is $3,000. So Mike writes that Maya McGinnis from the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, her and former Pennsylvania Governor Ed Rendell said interest payments on the debt rank as the fastest growing part of the federal budget. It will be bigger than Medicaid next year and larger than the military budget by 2025. Although the rate that they're increasing the military budget, maybe it won't change the order, but it is increasing pretty fast. And Mike writes, or whoever, it doesn't actually have a name here, but Schiff Gold says, these spiraling interest payments are one of the reasons the Federal Reserve can't let interest rates rise. Every uptick in the interest rate increases the government's interest payment. At the current trajectory, the cost of paying the annual interest rate on the U.S. debt will equal the annual cost of Social Security within 30 years. So it is going to be about number one. This debt, this interest keeps getting worse. If you've ever gotten into a spiral of credit card debt, I did back when I was like 19 or so. I'm like, oh, wow, free money. I'm sure it was spurred by low interest rates. But then it turned out that it was too easy. I was encouraged to spend and I was dumb and I spent too much and I couldn't afford it. And at the time that it came due, the interest rate went up and then it was like 29%. And then once the interest rate was too high, it was beyond my ability to pay for it. I was behind. I don't really know how I got out of it. Eventually in time I did, but it was a real mess for me. And that is a small example in comparison to what we're talking about when we're talking about a $22 trillion national debt, $75 trillion negative net worth if we're adding in just Social Security. And they go on and write, now imagine where we'd be if we were actually in a, quote, normal interest rate environment. If the interest rate on Treasury debt stood at 6.2%, which it was just 19 years ago in 2000. So this is not some imaginary number. It actually existed at 6.2% just a couple of decades ago. The annual interest payment on the current debt would nearly triple to $1.3 trillion. They write, this is a debt spiral. So if it tripled, we'd be at like 9,000. This would be the number 2 part of how they're spending already. if they were just at what was considered a normal interest rate. Maybe the market, no one knows what the interest rate's supposed to be. I know the Federal Reserve tells us what it's supposed to be. Some bankers probably do some white papers. But the market isn't free, and so therefore we don't know. The Federal Reserve has artificially held down the interest rates, and then they've artificially tried to slowly raise them to get them to normal. But holding it back or holding it down or pushing it up, all of it is abnormal. It is manipulation and control by politically connected bankers that are part of the Federal Reserve. And so, again, this is a debt spiral, and it can only get worse. And they go on. Once you're in the spiral, there really isn't a way out. Only a choice of crisis. Push rates down and risk a currency collapse, or allow rates to continue rising and burst the bubble economy. I think they're trying to do somewhere in between. I'm not sure where that's going to actually go, but they're definitely trying to do that. So looking over to the live chat, Mike Mary says, yep, I wrote that one. It's good stuff. R.C. Andrews says, the biggest scam, or one of them, is the myth of the common good. Yeah, they claim that this is all good stuff. Kathy Turner, Obama cut all the pro-American generals. He was sabotaging our military. I don't know. He was engaged in more war. He was more militaristic than even George Bush. So I don't know. They're all horrible to me. And I think sabotaging the military, really the best way to describe what is sabotaging the military is using it for unconstitutional purposes. These are people that I think in most cases are joining for honorable reasons. I think in some cases people are very desperate. They're coming in a place of financial need, and maybe they can get college support, whatever. But there's a pretty significant commitment to this. I don't think there was, even when I was like in that crazy credit card debt spiral, that I could have done it. That's a pretty significant commitment. And maybe the people who really believe in what's going on, they want to defend the country, they take an oath to the Constitution, they take great pride in this, and I've heard this from many, many people. But those people are being abused, repeatedly sent off to be involved in unconstitutional, undeclared, illegal, unjust, immoral foreign wars and occupations, fighting for the United Nations, for resolutions of the UN. This is sabotaging the military, and all modern presidents have been doing this, all of them. Really, really bad stuff. Justin Bayola, just the idea that a private entity gets to collect interest on our economy is absurd. Man, Scott Lashua, Neil, lots of really interesting comments. R.C. Andrews, oh yeah, I already said that one. But I appreciate all the feedback. I'm trying to keep up as much as I can with the comments without making it boring for the people who listen on iTunes. And I appreciate everybody who's been over there in the podcast edition that just listen in as well, and all the reviews that we've been getting, positive feedback. Jeff Bosert says, anyone who ever voted to steal our money should be tried for treason. I mean, I guess that's basically all of them, because they're all doing it. So unfortunately, we're in a really, really bad place. So I hope you found this interesting. It is very irritating and aggravating what's going on. I don't think that there is a solution to it in Washington, D.C., because both parties, leadership from both parties, and the bulk of both parties. And when I say the bulk, this is a real significant understatement. They are driving the country to the brink of economic ruin. It's only a matter of time, in my opinion. And I hear a lot of people talk about how Republicans, oh yeah, they'll say, yes, Boldin, Republicans are bad. But you know what? They're only driving to the fiscal cliff. Democrats drive there at 80 miles an hour, and Republicans are driving there at the speed limit. And I call bull on that, because if it keeps getting worse, if it's worse than it was under Obama, and there's some excuse as to why the spending has to keep rising, they're not going the speed limit. They're going as fast as Obama, or even faster. And being as bad as Obama, or a little bit less bad than Obama, isn't a win in my book. So to me, they're both horrible. They're both irresponsible. They both hate the Constitution, and trying to fix things through voting for one team or the other isn't solving the problem. It's just continually getting worse. Even if they were driving to the fiscal cliff at the speed limit, it's still going to end up there at some point. And maybe it gives us more time. If someone can make the case for that, maybe I'd be on board, but I haven't been able to find it just because the numbers don't seem to lie. Then again, maybe my statistician, my friend's statistician ex-girlfriend would be able to tell me how this is all skewed to my own views. But anyways, again, I hope you found it interesting. I really appreciate you spending some time with me today. Of course, we're here every Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 9:30 a.m. Pacific time, streaming live through YouTube, Facebook, Periscope, and DLive. I'll probably add Twitch in the near future. Of course, we've got all of our archives over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/goodmorningliberty. You can get the podcast edition there as well. And if you support the show, there's a few things that you can do that cost you absolutely nothing. All the platforms that we're available on are very easily triggered. They've all got algorithms, or most of them have algorithms. And the easy way to support the show, the free way, is to smash the like button, leave some comments, subscribe, share links, and all of that triggers the algorithms into showing the video or the audio to more people. And of course, if you want to support us financially, it's 10thamendmentcenter.com/members for as little as $2 a month. I really appreciate you spending some time with me today. I'll see you next time here on Good Morning Liberty. Have a great day.